Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing today? It was nice to be with many of you this morning for our worldwide wrap presentation. Now we make our next morning experience, the second of our lecture series, What Makes Us Human, a partnership between Temple Emanu-El and scientists in synagogues wrought by Sinai and synapses. This morning's presentation is entitled, Are You Just a Machine? Perspective from Physics, from Peter Saulson. Some interpretations of physics claim the world is deterministic. That is, everything behaves like a machine. Once set in motion, things have to happen the way mapped out by the laws of nature. Taken to an extreme, this claim would make that our brains and thus our minds are simply machines. Thus, we could not make free choices. Professor Peter Saulson will explore these topics and much more in his presentation. For those who don't know Peter, you can come to Morning Minion. You'll see him there quite often. But if you haven't seen him at Morning Minion, Peter Saulson was the Martin A. Pomerantz Professor of Physics at Syracuse University until he retired in 2019. His physics career was devoted to developing the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, although most of us just call it LIGO. Yes. Right? That's how most of us. Which in 2015 discovered gravitational waves coming from the collision of two black holes. A Providence resident since 2020, he now works on linking the theology of Abraham Joshua Heschel to scientific understanding of the universe. Let's give Peter Saulson a big round of applause. He also knows how to lead Oshrey. He is a tefillin mentor, and on top of that, he very generously allows us, and his wife Sarah allows us to cut through his lawn so we can get to my in-laws' house much faster on Shabbat afternoons. Based on some feedback we got from our initial lecture, Peter and I are going to present for about an hour or so, 45 minutes to about an hour or so, and then we'll have 15 minutes for a public Q&A, and we're hoping to wrap up around 12:15. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Once again, a big round of applause to Peter Saulson.
Thank you, Rabbi Fell, and thanks to all at TE, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning. I'm really excited about this whole Sinai and Synapses Scientists and Synagogues program. How many of you all were here for Victoria's talk? Okay, I'm glad to see so many hands. If your hand didn't go up, it's okay. You don't need her material as background, but the three talks in the series, Victoria's, mine today, and in 2 weeks, Professor Dennis Gilbride's from Georgia State, are, I think, nicely thematically related around various versions of the question that we've called what makes us human. And my version today, as a physicist, I'm interested in particular in, are you just a machine? And so let me practice this.
It's a little slow. You just got to be patient with it. The computer has a mind of its own.
I thought it was just a machine.
It's just a machine, but it has a mind of its own. Is it not advancing?
Which?
Just looking right.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, excellent. So, is the sound good here in the room as well?
It's
hear?
Close to your...
Okay. So, sometimes crisp formulations of a problem are kind of scary. So I've drawn out my "Are you just a machine?" question and rephrased it as, can everything about you be explained as if you were only a very complicated machine? And this question will turn on what we mean by everything. And so I want you to be alert to possible interpretations of everything, but to make the question vivid, I put on this slide
pictures representing the two extremes of a view, and maybe a lot of people in the room will end up not at either extreme, but one extreme on the left is one of my favorite toys from my childhood, Mr. Machine. Anyone else have one of these when you were a kid? I see a few other people who were similarly warped by playing with this wonderful wind-up toy. And to represent the idea that we're nothing like a machine, I've got this picture of some kids having a great time in the summertime, which hopefully will come in another few weeks here in Rhode Island. So yet another way of framing the question, are you just a machine, is this quote that I found from my favorite Jewish thinker, the 20th century theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel. And in one of his essays, he framed the question as, what am I? A mass of protoplasm, a complicated robot, a tool-making animal? Am I anything more than just a physical being? Now, I'm going to use Heschel as a touchstone at several points in this talk because he is a touchstone in my thinking. Another person who's a touchstone in my thinking maybe is a little more surprising. This is a non-Jewish writer, Marilyn Robinson, and her name has gotten a little bit squeezed off of the slide. Would people prefer to see every word that I've got? Oopsie. I would rather that we do it not in slideshow mode.
Sure.
Oh, I see that. Oh my goodness, it's a different computer.
Yeah, all right.
That's the problem.
We'll figure it out. You keep going. You keep going.
Okay.
All
right. You saw momentarily a picture of my other favorite thinker, Marilyn Robinson. She is most well known as a novelist. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel Housekeeping, I believe. She's written a whole series of wonderful novels using the same set of characters in the rural Midwest early in the 20th century. She's less well known, but I think she should be at least as well known as a thinker about science and religion. And you can find her specifically science and religion thoughts not so much in her novels, but in her essays, which are collected in several books. She gives a warning that goes along with Heschel's question. She warns anyone who wants to too glibly assume that we are in some sense like a machine. She says it's an error of much scientific thinking to exclude much that we do know about the vast fabric and the fine grain of the cosmos. So Heschel's question and Robinson's warning are going to be framing my thinking about this question that I want to share with you today. Now let's look back at...
Try the right arrow.
At what we learned from Victoria Templar Rotko last week. She, in a fabulous talk that I enjoyed a great deal, and I think most of you all who were here enjoyed it as well, she showed how much of who we are can be mapped on to parts of our brains, and showed in a beautiful way that taught me a lot I didn't know before, how much the brain is the basis for huge portions of our lives. But as I think she indicated towards the end of her talk, and as I want to emphasize even more today, there's a real open question before you go full on neuroscience, we are meat machines all the way. There's really an open question, is everything about us determined by the laws of nature as applied to the brain, or is there any room for free human agency? So, what I'll be talking about today is one version of the framing question. The question is determinism true? Now, determinism is a technical term from physics, but don't worry, I will explain it so that everyone will know what I'm talking about. So first I'll explain what is meant by determinism in its strictest form. It's the idea that you are, in fact, just a machine, and in fact, the universe as a whole is just a machine. And once we all agree on what it means and why you might even frame the question that way, I will show you why, in fact, the claim that determinism applies to the whole universe and or to your mind, why that claim cannot be true. But having set that up, there's another version, a less strict and therefore much more plausible version of are you a machine? And that's an idea that goes by the term naturalism. So I'll explain what's meant by the term naturalism, give some reasons to think that it might be plausible, and then the last part of my talk will be showing how, depending on how strict or how open-minded you are about your understanding of nature and what therefore naturalism would include, you may or may not think that there's good scientific reason to believe that we're machines. And by the end, I will be making a full-throated argument that no, in any important sense of the term, we're not machines. Okay, so there's my tip-off. Now, here is why it might be a problem to believe that we're machines. When you think about us not necessarily as objects of scientific study, but as human beings, instead, you realize that a lot of what makes us human are things like our creativity, our ability to make moral choices, or even the ability to say I and you. And one way of seeing why this might be in tension with physics is that all of these things involve aiming at a future goal, at something that doesn't exist yet. But when I am thinking with my physics hat on only, I'm thinking, well, here's what physics teaches us, that the way nature works is that it obeys laws of nature that have built into the way the whole mechanism of physics functions. If we are thinking we're applying laws of nature to explain something, we are predicting the future based on the state of the universe as it was in the past. And goals play absolutely no role in physics. So the question is, are we, as people who are loyal to science, I assume most of us are in this room, but also loyal to our humanity, can we believe that goals are real features of the world? So another way of framing the whole question of this talk, even in terms of those two extreme pictures, Mr. Machine or the kids playing, is can goals be real features of the world? So before I get into the rest of my formal presentation, I'd like us to do a personal check-in. So I'm going to propose 5 possible beliefs that each of you as individuals might have about where you stand on the question of, am I a machine? So I'd like you to look into your soul and ask which of these 5 potential beliefs best describes your own beliefs about who you are and who you work and how you work. At one extreme, you might believe my body does stuff and that's all there is, full stop. Or I seem to make choices, but actually I realize that I'm at the mercy of machinery behind the scene or urges that I can't control. You might think I try to do what I want to do, but I often don't succeed. Something else is taking over. Or you might be at stage 4, although I often struggle, I'm usually able to do what I hope to do. Or if you're lucky, you might be in the category of I'm able to figure out what I ought to do and almost always succeed in doing it. So take about 30 seconds, reread these off the screen, think about which view of how you work best describes your own belief. And I'll come back and ask you all about it. So think for a moment. Maybe turn to your neighbor if you need some advice on how you might think. Yes?
Would sometimes be just as good.
Yeah, you don't have to exactly Okay, what I would like to do.
Some people who are further back from the screen are having trouble seeing.
Okay.
Can you go back to the large look?
I can try.
I'll keep you keep lecturing,
Yes.
and I'll take.
Okay, so we're going to make the print larger. Thanks for that suggestion. Until we do that, is that going to help?
I think so. We'll keep going. You keep going.
Maybe that.
Yeah.
What's the deal? Yeah,
Okay, that's a little bit
okay,
better. Yeah.
that'll work. Okay, so I just want to do a completely unscientific poll. I want to ask you to raise your hand right now if something like position number 1, my body does stuff and that's all there is to it, best describes your own feeling of how you work as a human being. How many people are at position 1? How about closer to 2 than any of those other positions? Raise your hands. How about somewhere in the vicinity of 3? Okay, a lot of hands are up. How about position 4? All right. Oh, that is great. And how about position 5? Nice. Okay, for people who couldn't see, for people on Zoom who couldn't see in the room, almost nobody raised his or her hand for number 1, very few for 2, and I would say that 4 was the most popular choice, 3 maybe second, and 5 was more represented than I would have hoped for. That is great. So, now, if you answered 1, maybe there was a couple of you here, then you are a determinist. Any answer 2 or higher, certainly 3 onwards, you have serious doubts about determinism, and I will confess that I probably would have raised my hand somewhere in the 3 or 4 range myself, just to let you know what's going on. Okay, so that's a way of giving you a preview of where you're likely to come down in this discussion, and maybe in the question and answer period, we might revisit the question of whether you thought I stacked the deck on these questions or made it fairly, but I thought that would be a helpful exercise. All right, so let's go back to understanding what determinism is and why it might be that some people believe in it before we come to see what the problems are. So going back to my roots as a physicist, we know as physicists that our subject was founded in 1687, and we know the exact year by Isaac Newton. That year, of course, he'd been thinking physics thoughts for a long time, but that's the year when he published the first great textbook on physics, the Principia Mathematica. And this cartoon is a reminder of what we all know about the source of Newton's inspiration. He was sitting, thinking, trying to figure out how the world worked, sitting under an apple tree. An apple fell, and of course he wasn't the first person to discover that apples fall, but he was the first person to realize that he could see a way to explain an apple's falling with the same concepts as he could use to explain the fact that the moon orbited the Earth and that the moon raised tides in the ocean. And that's when he knew, okay, that he was on to something. Now, I do not aspire to offer a physics class today, but I do aspire in one slide to teach you everything you need to know about physics. And honestly, when I taught freshman physics, anyone who really understood that one equation I'm displaying would get at least a B. Okay? This really is the essence of physics. Of course, when a physicist says really understand, it's kind of hard, okay? But anyway, so Newton's most famous equation, for some reason he wrote it in the wrong order. It means the same thing. Raise your hand if you ever heard the equation F equals ma. Okay, about half of y'all, that's pretty good. I prefer to do a little algebra and write it in the form A equals F over M, because in the grammar of mathematics, we like to have the result on the left-hand side of the equal sign and the cause on the right-hand side of an equal sign. So let's take this equation apart just enough to know the story. So A is Newton's symbol for acceleration, for change of motion, because one of Newton's starting points was that motion doesn't in itself need an explanation. Anything that's moving ought to continue to move in a straight line at constant speed. That is the natural state of the world, unless there is an influence on some object that we call a force that pushes, pulls, tugs, you name it. There's lots of English language synonyms for force. If there's a force applied to some object that can speed it up, slow it down, turn its motion in some way. And so motion itself doesn't need an explanation, but changes in motion do, and Newton gave the explanation for a change in motion. It is the total of all forces applied to an object. And the divided by m is just there to make the numbers come out. Mass is actually an interesting concept that Newton clarified, but never mind. The basic idea is that changes in motion are caused by forces. Now, for centuries, we knew that this was all there was to the world. I want to complicate that 5 or 10 slides down, but let me say, as a physics professor, I would teach this equation and I would sell it for many semesters before we had to get to a point where we saw why this wasn't 100% correct. This is really a profound idea. Okay, so now you know physics. And even though I'll eventually show you where this might break down a bit, I mean, this is fabulous. Physics teaches us what things are out there, how they go, what makes them go, what makes change happen in the world. And I'm showing you a couple of diagrams of some of my favorite physics problems, how far a cannonball moves when you shoot it at different angles and with different amounts of gunpowder in the cannon, how shooting an object out horizontally from a tall tower might make it just go really far on the Earth or might put it into orbit, like an artificial satellite or like the moon. So this slide already encapsulates Newton's history that the way objects are affected by gravity on the Earth, like falling objects, it's just another version of how the moon goes around the Earth. And in fact, among the greatest triumphs of physics as Newton taught us about it are its account of how the solar system works and how the larger universe as a whole works. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the solar system, which is precisely to scale in terms of the sizes of the individual planets and the sun. Here's the big sun over here, Mercury, Venus, and Earth, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and I have to stop myself from saying Pluto because we no longer consider Pluto a planet. It's only a minor planet. Physics is fabulous at explaining how this goes and why the solar system is around at all. So much so that it occurred to a number of Newton's followers that what you might really think of the whole universe as some kind of clockwork. That was the 17th and 18th centuries' profoundest metaphor for a complicated machine. And the picture I've put on this slide is an image of one of the coolest high-tech toys of the 18th century. This is an orrery, which is to say a clockwork model of the solar system. All these things on these stalks up in the upper part of the orrery represent the individual planets, and down here in the bottom is the hidden clockwork that makes them all turn at the right rate and show you where the various planets are in their orbit around the sun at any given moment. And if you have a little astronomical imagination, you can imagine putting your eyeball on the model of the Earth there and looking around and see where you would see the various planets in the sky at night. That takes a little bit of extra work. This is one of the most beautiful orreries ever made. It's from the 18th century. So this metaphor of the universe as a clockwork had a lot of basis in what Newton explained, so much so that there's a perhaps apocryphal, but nevertheless, it ought to have been true. This thing ought to have happened, whether it happened or not exactly this way. This was a dialogue between the then Emperor Napoleon in 1802 and one of the leading lights of France. He was a senator and also one of the great physicists, just sort of like one rank below Newton, Pierre-Simon Laplace. And we think they spoke about a really profound question. Emperor Napoleon is supposed to have remarked, after having read the latest book by Laplace, said, "You've written this huge book on the system of the world," that is to say the solar system, without once mentioning the author of the solar system. And Napoleon thought that this was a great dig at Laplace. And what Laplace is supposed to have said is, "Sire, I had no need of that hypothesis." And the reason people want this to be true, whether this dialogue actually happened, is that "I had no need of that hypothesis" became the slogan of the physics movement. Not physics as a science, but of the philosophical belief that physics teaches us everything that we need to know. Now, what did Laplace actually mean by that remark, assuming that he said it? At a minimal level, he might just have meant that Newton's laws of nature were enough to explain the motions of the planets around the sun. That was the main topic of his book. But maximally, and what many people hoped it actually meant, was that all motions of everything everywhere throughout physical existence could be accounted for by that same paradigm of A equals F over M. And if that were true, it raised a really profound philosophical question, namely, would there be anything left to be understood about anything in the universe, not just the motions of the planets in the solar system, perhaps even including human life? So, what's at stake with this maximal interpretation? Well, quite a bit. And let's just flesh it out a little more. Our bodies are made out of things. Therefore, our brains are made out of things, small material things. Newton didn't know this, but they're made out of atoms. And so it raises the question, if we could know all the forces on every atom, and we think we know the laws by which atoms interact, shouldn't we be able to predict what they would do? And if our brains are our minds, as many people believe, doesn't that say that if our brains are predictable, then our minds are predictable? And so it raises yet again the question, are you just a machine? Is this amazing piece of living material, which we know is made out of material objects, is it in some sense just a more complicated version of this? So, what would it take for this Laplacian idea to have been correct? And this is the idea that has come to be called determinism. So, what it would have involved is to apply the deterministic paradigm, you need to know precisely all of the forces on every object in the universe, and you need to know, at least at some instant of time, where everything is and how those things are moving at that moment, because Newton's laws just tell you then how the motions change. So we could rephrase the question that Napoleon asked, namely, can you really explain the motions of the planets in the solar system with this paradigm? Now, if you go out and buy an orrery, and you can go on eBay or your favorite site and buy one today, is it really representing precisely what's going on? Well, that orrery you're going to buy is probably going to have 8 or maybe 9 planets in it. But if it's the real solar system we're talking about, we now know that those planets have altogether at least 200 moons. And if we include all the minor planets, including the asteroids, there are over 600,000 of them. And nobody is able to, with complete precision and accuracy, predict all of those motions. We can do it pretty darn well, but even with the most amazing supercomputers, there's still some slop to the issue because the standards are really high. You have to know exactly where everything is, exactly how it's moving, and know the precise forces on everything. And in fact, physics has, for better or for worse, I think for better, but in this case for worse, gotten a little more complicated since Newton and Laplace's time. We know that there's a lot more to understanding reality than Newton knew. And among the things we know are more complicated are things like chaos, relativity, quantum mechanics. I'll have a little more to say about quantum mechanics in a moment. And we know that giving an exact account of everything that's out there in the universe, we don't have it yet. We think there's this stuff called dark matter. We think there's something else called dark energy. And we're pretty sure that we don't really know all of the forces on everything. So let me just expand on our level of uncertainty a little bit and point out 2 reasons that you should be suspicious of any intuition that you might have about how reality works. The most recent Nobel Prize in Physics, awarded this past fall, was given for experimental proof of an amazingly bizarre phenomenon called quantum entanglement. I don't have time to explain in detail what it means, other than to say it's unbelievably cool. And it's cool because the way the universe actually works, as shown by these experiments, makes a mockery of any simple intuition you have about how space works and how time works. Now, here's another reason to suspect that your intuition about how reality works may not be the whole story. Time is a lot more subtle as we live it than as I taught it as a physics professor. If you asked me how time worked, woke me up in the middle of the night and say, tell me about how time feels, I would say, well, it's now. And now a moment later, it's now. And now a moment later, it's now. That's not what I taught my physics students. That's not how physics handles time or even can think of time. To physics, every moment of time in the entire history of the universe has equal reality to it. And there's no such thing as now. There's no such thing as waiting. There's no such thing as the flow of time. That's a pretty big disjunction between our best scientific description of things and how we actually feel the universe works. So what I would like us to take from this is that we have lots of good reasons from our more advanced physics knowledge to suspect, in fact, to be darn sure that we can't treat the brain as a clockwork. It really does not work that way at all. But now, what if you were incautious enough, that's a polite word, to try to predict how the brain and then perhaps your mind worked as a machine? What would be involved in carrying out the Laplacian Newtonian program of knowing the positions and motions of everything in a brain and as well as the forces on it? Well, here's some things I learned. I think Victoria told us some of these facts, and I double-checked them by looking them up. Each of our brains contains about 100 billion neurons. Those are the individual cells out of which your brain is made. And they are interconnected in an intricate enough way that there are actually 100 trillion connections from one neuron to another. And the wiring diagram, which is to say that which would tell us which neuron influences which other neuron, we have the vaguest ideas. I shouldn't say Vicky's talk was vague. We learned a ton of really interesting stuff. But remember, she said, okay, here's a part of your brain called the, fill in the blank, okay? The prefrontal cortex, all right? That's fabulous. And what she taught us about it was fabulous. But did she give us a 100 billion element diagram with 100 trillion lines connecting all the parts? No. And it's a good thing, too, because it was tricky enough to follow what she had to say. And we don't even have that, let alone we don't have, or are close to having precise laws that teach us exactly, if one neuron does something, which other neurons that it's connected to are going to do precisely what. We have lots of good indications, but we're far from understanding it in detail. And I want to think a bit about those numbers, okay? Physics is a lot about numbers. So 100 billion neurons. 100 billion is a number that I'm familiar with from when I taught astronomy. It's the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. It's a big number. It's also the number of galaxies in the observable universe. 100 billion is a big number. $100 trillion is a much bigger number. I can't come up with any example from astronomy where I use the word 100 trillion. Okay? This is a hyper-astronomical idea. So before you think that you can account for how your brain functions as a very fancy clockwork, you need to confront these numbers. And the lesson that I draw is not only don't we know enough physics, but there's no way we could know enough neuroscience in enough detail. No way that I can possibly imagine to ever carry out the program of treating your brain like a machine. We can learn tons, and I know Victoria could come back here in a couple of years and teach us new cool stuff, but it's not going to be the complete account. So, determinism is dead. However, many of us would wave the flag, long-lived naturalism. So let me explain why, even though I have hopefully buried determinism for good, there's something that's maybe almost as interesting that we have to think again, is this a good description? So even though we can't ever carry out the program of accounting for our brains as machines, can't we at least think and believe with some conviction that in principle our brain is a machine and that it's merely a question of we don't have big enough computers and we don't quite have enough knowledge yet? And that's the idea that goes by the name of naturalism. So naturalism is a one word that you can have in your head, and if you want a definition of naturalism in one sentence, it is the belief that nature is all there is. And when you say it that way, it seems almost unexceptionable. But let's think about it carefully and raise the question, does this idea, nature is all there is, tell us enough to know what the world includes and what it doesn't, how it works, and whether the future is determined by the past? So naturalism, anything that you can define in one sentence, you should already be concerned that maybe it's got some subtleties to it. So I've put on this slide 3 different interpretations of what the sentence, nature is all there is, might mean. At one extreme, the idea that nature is all there is might mean we are just machines made of atoms, get used to it. I can't prove it to you and I can't carry out the program, but that's still how it works, so suck it up. Other people who claim to subscribe to naturalism, to the view that nature is all there is, would say, no, what it really means is there's nothing spooky in the world, but nature itself is pretty darn remarkable. And then maybe at the other extreme, but it's an extreme I take seriously, is the idea that nature is so astonishing, so fruitful, so pregnant with possibility that we really need to expand our concept of what nature is. And for that idea, I put the word nature in quotes because when you think about it, really the question of naturalism hangs on what you think nature is. But I want to actually show you that this set of ideas that are different possible interpretations of the idea of naturalism actually come back to the most profound question about whether the paradigm of physics is applicable to how we function as human beings. Because physics, in whatever form, any version of the machine idea applied strictly, is based on the idea that if you know the universe at one moment, then that determines everything into the future. On the other hand, I'll speak just personally, I kind of feel like I decide things and I get up someday and a few days in my life, I've really, added a little bit to the world, all right? So rather than feeling all the time like the past determines everything, I feel like there's some moments where a better way of understanding existence is to say we can create a better future than exists today, and we create it through actions that we take, not just as the working out of the consequences of how the universe was in the past. So the question really comes down to this continuum. Does the past determine everything, or do we have the capacity to be active in creating a future? So we want to compare the strict form of naturalism with less strict forms. The strict form, I hear a few chuckles. This is, I think, in diagrammatic form, what adherence to strict naturalism means. Most people who will say, I am really a naturalist, a strict naturalist, then give you the list of everything it tells you not to believe in. The supernatural, just the word tells you that it's the thing that we naturalists don't believe. Of course, not knowing exactly what's in nature, it's hard to know what the word supernatural means as well, but let it go. Usually, people say, I'm a naturalist, a strict naturalist. That means I don't believe in God. Usually, it means I don't believe in the soul. There's another word that is easier to say than to understand exactly what it means. But now we come to some things where at least we think we have some ideas what they might mean. Strict naturalism usually is taken to mean I don't believe in a mind that is anything other than the meat in your skull. And sometimes it also means we don't believe in free will. But I would say as a physicist that you really can't just extrapolate from that dialogue between Napoleon and Laplace, because we've learned a lot more about the world since then. And if you really force people to explain the reason for their belief in strict naturalism, if that's what they believe, you'll find that there is no scientific basis for the strictest form of naturalism. If you adhere to it, you adhere to it because it seems right. And let me now close with a few thoughts about what's entirely left out of most discussions that start from the position of naturalism, the question of ourselves and our values. I'd like to assert that ourselves and our values are parts of nature. And here's a picture of my favorite Jewish thinker, Abraham Joshua Heschel again. He stressed that there was a whole set of phenomena that we believe in that are, he would claim, impossible to reduce to scientific categories. The feeling of being myself, my interiority, or yours, our participation in the world, our ability to make choices and do things, and our values, how we guide the choices and our participation in the world. And this cluster of things, Heschel, to have a single word to attach to it, called the ineffable. The hard to describe, the hard to say, but the really true. And by framing that, he was really setting out a challenge to the strict naturalists. He asked, can strict naturalists believe in the correctness of justice? Does that idea even make sense to naturalism? Can a strict naturalist believe in the reality of love or in the requiredness of compassion? Can a strict naturalist believe in the reality of goodness or in the validity of truth or the compellingness of beauty? Let's make sure we can see this. And with that challenge, we need to respond. Marilyn Robinson responded by the assertion of her belief that values like beauty, wonder, and truth have absolute reality. And I love this quote of hers: if through our minds and senses we participate in absolute reality, then beauty is an active element in creation. Beauty is a conversation between humankind and reality, and we are an essential part of it. Or Heschel, who said, we're not even on the same page. Free will is so important that the opposite of free will is not determinism at all. It's hardness of heart. So most days I want to be a naturalist, but I want to be the kind of naturalist who is able to see and accept that nature includes human agency. Nature must be more than things that are made out of atoms. So I want to just about wrap up by proposing the bumper sticker test. Is this the best view of the world, the bumper sticker that says stuff happens? Or is the better bumper sticker practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty? which bumper sticker do you want on your car? And I'd like to close by advertising that my good friend Dennis Gilbride will be here 2 weeks from today, and he will be speaking on what does it mean to be a person, views from psychology. So thank you very much for your attention. The floor is yours.
And now the rebuttal. Now, I confess that my slideshow is nowhere near as nice as Professor Saulson's, but the information contained within, I hope, will be just as meaningful. Excellent. And I think we can even do it this way. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. No, I just swapped it out, yeah. It should adapt in a moment. About a month ago, I bought a Fitbit. And Shayna asked me, which version of the Fitbit do you want, the basic model or the more advanced one? And I said, well, I'm going to get the more advanced one, obviously. And she asked why. And I said, because the more advanced one can tell me not only how many steps have I taken, but it tells me my oxygen saturation in my blood. It tells me how I'm sleeping. It tells me all these other data points about my life. And she looked at me and said, do you really need a watch to tell you that you're not sleeping well? Right? Do you need to be able to quantify that you're feeling tired? Right? Like, does it make a difference to you if you are 7 units tired or 12 units tired? If you're tired, you're tired. And more importantly, if the Fitbit told you you slept well, but you woke up tired, what is reality? Right? And so it causes me to question sort of like what is measurable in life and what is not measurable. And if the things that are not measurable, does it make it any less real? And so for that, I want to share a couple of slides, a couple of things from the Jewish perspective that perhaps can shed some light on this topic or sort of have this topic in a Jewish perspective. The first, this slide will be recognizable to you if you come to our daily Izman Kodesh session. And that is the juxtaposition of two of the blessings which are said one right after the other. The first is a recognition that we are in fact stuff made up of atoms, and that part of the way we navigate through this world is really physical. It's this bracha asher yatzar, which thanks God for the gift of our bodies, in which we say, blessed are you, God, sovereign of time and space, who crafted the human body with wisdom, creating within it many openings and passageways. It is known and revealed to you that should even a single passageway rupture or a single opening close up, it would no longer be possible to exist and stand before you. Baruch atah Adonai, healer of all flesh, who creates wondrously. This bracha forces us each and every morning, and as codified in the Shulchan Aruch, every time you use the bathroom, to remind yourself what a gift it is to have a functional body that does what it needs to do, right? That can be measured and healed and can be damaged depending on how we take care of our bodies. And lest we think too quickly that that's all there is to who we are, the next bracha is Elohai Neshama, which thanks God for the gift of the Neshama. Now, I'm going to use the word Neshama, but as Peter and I discussed, Neshama has all this alternative thinking with it, right? So let's just say there is a part of us that is not physical, a part of us that is not of this world, a part of us that does not obey the laws of physics, but is still part of this world. And so when I introduce this bracha in the mornings, you'll chuckle because it's the same way almost every time. It's the part of us that is divine, the part of us that is eternal, the part of us that is pure, the part of us that we can't quite measure, but is still there. And that bracha says, my God, the soul that you have given me is pure. We can play with language and translation. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me, you watch over it when it is in me, and in the future you will take it from me. But then you will restore it to me in the world that is coming. As long as this soul, this neshama, this non-earthly part is within me, it's my job to recognize you, God and God of my ancestors, master of all souls, Baruch atah Adonai, who restores the soul to the lifeless form. And so this is a central idea in Judaism, right? That who we are isn't just bones and synapses and neurons, but there's a part of us that once our body stops working, and that's the language we use in my house to describe death, your body stops working, there is a part of you that continues on. Don't ask me how it works. Don't ask me how to measure it. Don't ask me to touch it. Don't ask me to like point to it. But for me, it is real, right? And many of us, so many of our traditions are based on this concept that a part of us does indeed live on forever. It's why we say Kaddish. It's why we do Yiskar. And there is a tendency, I think, to want to say, you know, you live on in people's minds and in people's hearts, and you sort of, your fingerprints and your words echo through the world, right? And I think that's a part for those of us who are more on the low-grade naturalist, resonates with us. But there's also a part that our tradition pushes us to say, yeah, we don't exactly know. And so we're going to sort of, here is insight into how the world works. You see this reflected, and I think it's really neat. Whenever we say the word olam, as in Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, that olam, we tend to think of olam as a world, olam haba, the world that is coming. But you can just as easily connect the word olam, right, to the future, right? Le'olam va'ed, right? And so our translation, our Siddur, does a beautiful job of connecting time and space by translating it as time and space. Baruch atah Adonai, our God, sovereign of time and space, right? And as Peter mentioned in his presentation, time doesn't work necessarily the way that we think of it, right? Space, I would argue also, maybe we don't fully understand. Does that work or no? Can we talk about that? Or
Time's trickier.
Time's trickier, right? But space, right? We can play with those terms. It's not what we actually see only in front of us, right? And so I want to share a couple of ideas, and one more piece with time, about the trickiness of time. And I don't know if I shared this last week or 2 weeks ago. Even God's name, Yod-He Vav-He, contains within it all the different tenses, past, present, and future. And I think, I don't know if I shared this, the Shulchan Aruch teaches us whenever you're praying, one of the things, if you can't think about everything, just think about that there was a world before you, there's going to be a world after you, and you're living in it, but for right now. And so that alone sort of changes your understanding of reality. Our tradition is comfortable with accepting the unknowable. And in fact, it's a pet peeve of mine whenever you look at religious texts which go into granular detail explaining that we know everything, because I think part of what our tradition is meant to teach us is to feel comfortable not knowing everything, right? So if you look at the creation story, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. I love it. No, it adds to the mystique of what's happening, right? It was that was meant to happen, right? Right? So when answering the question, why does the Torah begin with the letter bet in Bereshit? Because you would think the Torah should begin with the letter Aleph. And the rabbis have a field day explaining why the Torah is created with the letter bet. Rabbi Yonah says in the name of Rabbi Levi, why with the letter bet? It says, just as the letter bet is closed on both sides, on all sides, right? You can't know what's above, below representing sort of an ancient understanding of how the world was built, and what came before. In Hebrew, we go this way. So it sort of says is we can understand only a part of reality, but not a reality in its entirety. Rabbi Yehuda ben Patzi says, when the creation story, Pazi came, the story according to Bar Kapra, why was the world created with a bet? To teach you, in fact, that there are two worlds. Bet is the number 2 in Gematria. There's the world that we see, this world, and there's also the world to come, Olam Haba. Now, whenever someone tries to describe what the world to come looks like, and they say it's like a banquet with all delicious foods, and we all sit and learn Torah side by side. My question is, does that world, do we have bodies? Do we have mouths? Do we eat because we're hungry? What happens if we eat too much in Olam Haba? Like, what happens in that context, right? But it's just to teach you that there's something beyond what we see in this world. Another interpretation why a bet, it's because bet is the word for bracha, blessings, and not aleph because it's a blessing of curses. It's the same word. And so it's this idea that we don't fully understand the world, but one thing that we do base our world on is that this world is full of brachot. This world is full of blessings and goodness, and it's our jobs to try to seek it out. Another one, this idea that you have to see the world as a blessing and not a curse for it to endure. So then if that's the case, what makes us human to go answer this question? As Professor Rotko pointed out last week, part of it is the ability to decide what it is that we want to do, to have choice, to say, I want to try to do this, or I want to change this. And so in the creation story, at least the first creation story, it says, God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish in the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle on the whole earth, all the creeping things that creep on the earth. And God created humanity, or the earthling, in God's image. In the image of God, they were created, male and female. God created them, right? And so what does it mean to be created in God's image, right? Does it mean 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth? Does it mean that, we have 2 hands, 2 legs? And certainly there are parts of the Hebrew Bible which heavily rely on anthropomorphism to describe how God operates. But our tradition really doesn't focus on the physical. The things that make us godlike, or that make us human, aren't really physical. God, here's a text from Sanhedrin where it says, God created humanity with the first earthling to show the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be God. For if a man strikes many coins from one mold, they all look exactly the same. But the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be God, made each person in the image of God, yet no one looks exactly the same way, right? There are these beautiful Hasidic stories which says, we're all created in God's image. What does it look like? And so it tells the story of looking at people and trying to find God's image in each of us. If you're looking for a physical answer, the closest I can get is eyes, right? If you want a physical answer, you look at someone's eyes and you imagine everything they've seen, right? Their understanding of the world, their experiences. It sort of opens your mind to what it could be. And that's if you're looking specifically for a physical explanation. But the truth is there are many, many more rabbinic texts which says what makes us human, right? And or how do we identify that part of us which is divine and ineffable, right? It's the way that we behave and the way we conduct ourselves. There's a text in Sota which says you should try to walk like God. And so what does that mean? For those who are Mel Brooks fans, it means walk this way, right? But what it really means to walk in God's ways, right, is it mean that just as God takes care of the naked as he made clothes for in the Garden of Eden, so too we should take care and provide clothing for the naked. Just as God visits the sick when he visited Abraham after his circumcision, so too we should visit the sick and take care of them. And finally, Rambam says that what makes us human, right, that special, unique quality we have, is that we have the ability to make choices. And as Professor Templar Rotko shared with us, right, in her research, I think I'm quoting you correctly, yes? Right? That we can make choices, whereas animals maybe respond strictly to instinct or to stimulus or habits. We can decide what our habits are actually going to be. And so as I look at this text and I think about your presentation, it can be scary because we base so much of our lives on physics, right? We base so much of our lives of saying we know everything, we understand everything. It makes us feel comfortable and I think sleep well at night. But our tradition, I think, wants us to recognize that maybe we don't know everything, right? There is a part of us that we can't fully articulate, fully describe, but is yet very, very real. And I would argue a lot of what we've done for the past 2,000 years as Judaism is really trying to cultivate an awareness of the world that fully recognizes the things that we are responsible for, discover how this world works, but also leaves a little bit reserves a little bit to recognize that maybe there is something beyond this world that we don't fully understand, and try to cultivate an awareness, an appreciation, and of that in our lives, and bring that more and more into the world. Thank you. The time is 12:06, so we want to give about 10 minutes for questions and hopefully some answers. If you could help out by not giving a 3-minute intro to your question and then simply asking the question, that would be helpful. And please address who you want to answer that question. Yeah. And tell everyone who you are.
I'm John Berenson. Thank you so much for provocative and intelligent ideas. So this is mostly directed to Peter. And Rabbi Fell, I disagree with you. I didn't hear your comments as a rebuttal.
Oh, it was just a joke. It was just a joke, just to be clear. Yeah.
So I'm offering myself up as your foil. This is for the upliftment of the community. I offer myself as a foil. You say that you can't understand the 100 billion neurons nor the 100 trillion connections. If I ask you to go back 75 years, could you have imagined the mapping of the human genome these qualities of mystery and awe and wonder that Heschel talks about, we are beginning to learn about these because of the research done at all over, Johns Hopkins and NYU through the psychedelic research. So, okay, your turn.
Going to rephrase the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
So John Berenson asked, if I can shorten it just slightly, isn't the question of carrying out the Laplacian paradigm merely a question of we don't yet know enough, we don't yet know, have powerful enough computers?
I fully expect you to tear that to shreds because I don't actually believe that myself. But
Okay. Right. You're correct to point out that the way I phrased the argument is as an argument of practicality. But let's make sure, first of all, before I give you a better argument, that we understand the practicality of it. If you want to hold in this day and age that the Laplacian paradigm is in principle true, you have to imagine that at this future time we will know all of the laws of nature precisely, that we will know the position and motion of everything in the world at some particular moment. And 100 trillion, I was trying to let you all down easy. 100 trillion is way too small a number to really describe the problem. That's the number of synapses in a single brain. What if I reminded you that the real Laplacian paradigm would be to understand the forces on every single atom in every single brain on every planet in the vast universe? If ever there was a literal situation where the term "it boggles the mind" could be applied, it is that. So that doesn't even begin to say all of the things we don't understand about physics that we would have to put into the right-hand side of the equation A equals F over M. So given that there are so many reasons to realize that the problem is impossible, to me, forgive me for personalizing it in this way to you, John, my good friend and across the street neighbor, but to me the question is, why would anyone even think that this was possible? Why? Okay, there is so much attachment in our world to this paradigm in spite of the fact that carrying it out is, now I will speak as a person, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculously difficult. So I end up feeling that when my good friend John is in this frame of mind, which he admitted isn't always, what we're actually seeing is the most profound expression of faith in our modern world. It is not a loyalty to anything that is known about science. It is a faith that, oh, we'll get it someday. And I would be happy if the one lesson that people took from my talk was that you can either have faith that we're actually human beings with values who make choices, who try, or you can have faith in the most unbelievable extension of the scientific paradigm beyond any rational justification. And if you want to leave this room as a committed, strict naturalist verging on a determinist, please do it, but know that you are more of a faith-centered person than anyone you look down on for thinking the opposite. Okay?
Sure. Label, go ahead.
Peter,
Yes.
I think the real proof that determinism in physics, that we are all machines, is wrong,
Yes.
is that if we accepted that, then the grandchildren would disprove a basic tenet of physics, that you can't have a perpetual motion.
That's lovely. So for the folks on Zoom,
Yeah.
Label Smith said, the existence of grandchildren disproves the physics paradigm because they are sources of perpetual motion. Thank you for that.
Corey, go ahead.
So thank you, Peter. Like I love naturalism as a concept. I guess I wonder if it's so weird to say. I wonder if it's a little too simplistic in that there is still dopamine, there's still endorphins, there are still like forces that affect our brain and impact our choices that we are not aware of, right? So is there value in taking that into consideration as we talk about this stuff too?
Victoria. Yes. So Corey asks, aren't there physical things about the brain that affect how we behave, that are the basis for a lot of what we do? Yes. And if I didn't know it before, Victoria's talk from 2 weeks ago was a beautiful illustration of precisely that fact. Nevertheless, I think I'm being true to what I heard Victoria say, that for all of the undoubted correctness of the physicality of our being to some degree, it does not provide in any way, shape, or form a complete account of who we are and all of the choices that we make. Yes, I mean, for goodness sake, is that a fair?
I think so. I think whether we have awareness or not I think it doesn't mean that we can. It's completely explainable.
Yes.
So I agree that the laws of the brain and behavior do follow the laws of nature, whether or not there's awareness or not is part of it, but it doesn't mean that determinism is true in my mind.
Mm-hmm. So rather than trying to summarize everything Victoria said 2 weeks ago, or even that beautiful answer, just say Victoria is on a similar page to me in terms of, yes, let's learn more as she does, but it does not account for everything. So, Rick?
Love your talks, love your comments. There's a very long philosophical tradition that says the choice between free will and determinism is a false choice. And it's called soft determinism. There's certain things about our lives we can control, and there's some elements over which we have little control. Years ago, I read a lovely essay by the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, Clouds and Clocks. It's elegant. And what he says is, much of life is like a clock. You can predict it, it's linear, it's orderly, but much of life is like a cloud. It's amorphous, it's hard to understand and grasp, and our task is to try to understand the connections between the clocks and the clouds in our lives. And as a Jew, that's how I live.
Yeah. It's interesting. On our Tuesday night adult education class, we are comparing two different Jewish philosophers. One who says everything in life is predetermined. One who says that everything is free will and you are entirely responsible for every single choice that you make. And another philosopher who says actually we're a combination of those two things. I think he wouldn't call it soft determinism, but I think he's sort of scratching at that. Look, if you're looking for opportunities to understand that we make choices, then many of us make choices throughout our lives, but also to deny that there is a part of us that is based on habits and habitual performance, right? Or a part of us that doesn't live in a strictly thoughtful, easily to identify way of thinking. I mean, just go to a kiddish line, right? Or go to a dessert buffet, right? People don't operate the way they're supposed to, right? There are other forces beyond their control. Anyway, sorry, Sally, and then we'll take maybe two more questions. Yeah, Sally, go ahead.
Okay, I want to read something real quick that Einstein wrote to a rabbi in the 1940s, and it's beautiful, and it puts all this together. And I'm standing up so you can all hear me. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. The striving to free up oneself from this delusion is the one issue of true religion. Not to nourish the delusion, but to try to overcome it is the way we reach the attainable measure of peace of mind. And I found it in a book by Naomi Levy called Einstein and the Rabbi, and it's beautiful, and I recommend it to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. What we'll do for our last round, we'll just take, if you can ask your questions, and then Peter and I will try to synthesize it as much as we can. Yeah. Tom.
Hey, I'm Thomas. Thank you both so much. I'm going to attend brevity in lieu of intelligibility. Do you think, as far as the machine metaphor goes, is there a way of thinking about it as spiritual machines that, for say, those of us who entertain those, not myself, but those who say that there's multiple dimensions, could those dimensions contain enough complexity to encompass the spiritual machine nature of, overlaying clocks made of clouds per se, and if we understand this physics as a game and the overlay of religious experience as a game, does the game itself change as we live it in art? But perhaps it evolves so slowly that it doesn't really matter to us. So.
We'll go to the next question, and we'll see how we can time all together. Yeah. Diane?
Just a quick one. You used, Peter, you used the term mind and you used the term brain.
Yes.
And you didn't, what I'm trying to understand is what's the difference?
Okay. Yes, a very straightforward question in principle. The question that Diane was raising is, couldn't I have been more clear, and shouldn't I be clear now, about the distinction between the mind and the brain? The brain is a material organ. You can weigh it, you can put probes in it and try to figure out something about how it works. The mind is our experience of being a living being. Now, I tried not to make a giant distinction because I wanted to give determinism. You may not believe I was trying to give determinism the benefit of the doubt, but there is a statement many people would subscribe to. I don't. That the mind is the brain, or a slightly less silly thing is the mind is what the brain does. That makes some sense. But the question really is everything explicable about our minds in terms of the brain is what I wanted to leave open. And for that reason, I didn't go into trying to connect those terms maybe as well as I should have. If we should not leave Tom's question alone because it was very profound, so profound, I'm not sure how good an answer I'll give, but if I could summarize that really interesting question in terms of one term I heard you use, is that isn't a good metaphor a spiritual machine? And it's a very evocative metaphor. I'm not sure I know enough about what a spiritual machine is or how it would work to know that I either subscribe to it or don't, but I want to sleep on that one. I think it's a really, really interesting question.
Okay.
We can take more privately also.
Why don't we do that? Yeah.
I just want to offer a two-sentence way of tying it together into my brain, and that is, we human beings don't like uncertainty because it causes us anxiety, and when we feel like we control things and understand that, we feel less anxious. But years ago, this sentence came out of my mouth, and I went, wow, I should remember what I said, which is, maturity is the ability to tolerate ambiguity.
So we'll close with this. I think one of the things our tradition gives us the chance to do is to do what you're describing, learn to live with ambiguity. When I was in rabbinical school, we had to pick you could choose to pick a major in rabbinical school. So I chose Midrashim, right? What's interesting about Midrash is it's a game to figure out how many different understandings you can have about a specific verse. Right, this Shabbat morning, I spoke about how there's one version of the giving of the 10 Commandments where they heard the 10 utterances, one where they heard nothing, one where they heard 2, and one where each person heard their own thing, right? And so when the more you define it, right, the less I think accurate you are in trying to define the thing that you're trying to get to. And so it's almost learning to live with not knowing exactly what it is, but not feeling that your inability to describe it somehow makes it less real or less authentic. And I think Judaism as a practice, right, if science is the art of being able to describe what's happening, perhaps one understanding of what Judaism does is it learns to give you the language and discipline to talk about that which is not fully able to, that which you cannot fully describe, right? That which you can't fully point to or touch or explain, and to be comfortable with that tension. And maybe that's something that all of us are trying and striving to do each and every day. We'll make a plug once again that our next presentation is on Sunday, February 26th. Professor Dennis Gilbride from Georgia State University will speak on the topic, What Does It Mean to Be a Person? Views from the World of Psychology. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I know Peter can stick around and answer a few extra questions. You feel free to approach the bench. I, unfortunately, have to take my mom to the airport. So have a good day, everybody.
Awesome.